Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight as we host the 2020-2021 academic year's first talk of the annual CEAS lecture series, sponsored by the University of Chicago's Center for East Asian Studies. My name is Hans Saucy, and I am Professor of Comparative Literature at the University of Chicago. For more information on the University of Chicago's Center for East Asian Studies and the CEAS lecture series, please visit the CEAS website and subscribe to receive weekly outreach emails. These links will be provided in the chat box. All you have to do is tap on the little chat icon. Tonight's program is sponsored together with the University of Chicago Library East Asian Collection. Please follow the link in the chat box to learn more about the collection. Furthermore, tonight, we will be adjusting the Zoom format to accommodate our usual fondness for lively interchange. After a short introduction, which I'm pronouncing, we will hear our speaker, Ian Johnson, for around 4 minutes and then move to the question and answer period. I invite you to submit your questions through the Q&A box within Zoom, so that I can relay them to the speaker. My associates and I will be monitoring the stream of questions all evening long, and I hope you won't hesitate to volunteer your remarks. Our speaker tonight, Ian Johnson, will be familiar to many of us as one of the most attentive and sympathetic observers of contemporary China. His byline appears frequently in the New York Times and the New York Review of Books, among other venues, and I understand that a Pulitzer Prize hangs on the wall of his study, just for decoration, of course. His books, among them Chinese Characters, Wild Grass, and The Souls of China, exemplify the methodology of participant observation, which was defined by one of my anthropologist friends as the art of hanging out. Hanging out with an assortment of curious characters, driven reformers, inspired believers in a variety of faiths, neighborhood organizers, low-lifes and high rollers, more of the former than the latter, has given Ian unparalleled insight into the thoughts, desires, and aspirations of Chinese people. This is simple, but not easy. Chairman Mao used to say that the Red Army lives among the people like fish in water. Although no Maoist, I hope Ian won't mind my appropriating this slogan to describe his way of being a foreigner in China. His secret is to give people his full attention and let them tell their own stories. He doesn't parachute in, get the story, and leave. He sticks with people for years, decades even, popping up to share the hot pot at the New Year's dinner or hoist the sofa on moving day. We see him participate fully in the worlds of his subjects, meditating in a half-built temple, sitting in the front row at a Christmas service, serving as the opponent in martial arts contests, passing out tea to pilgrims. The call and response of daily life is what he makes vivid for us through his writing. But I would describe it as intellectual history, a history of the life of ideas as experienced by non-salaried thinkers. And so I feel that it is a loss for both our countries that Ian was just compelled to leave China after some 20 years on the ground there and take up residence in Singapore this fall. A heavy-handed approach to foreign relations has interrupted a vital channel of understanding. This does not, however, keep Ian from thinking about China. Fortunately, a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities this year is supporting his writing on one of the most significant cultural debates in China, the discussion around history. No academic pursuit, but a quiet struggle over the identity, the meaning, and the ownership of the past. In countries where power is centralized and education is conceived as the training up of loyal citizens, to take history into one's own hands is no trivial matter. It is a pleasure and an honor to welcome Ian Johnson to the virtual space of our annual Center for East Asian Studies lecture. Ian, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm speaking to you, as Han said, from Singapore, where I am today on Friday. It's already Friday morning here, about to exit of quarantine. So the light you see on the wall behind me is the sun rising on a new day outside of this 5-star hotel for me, hopefully. And so it's been a time also of forced thinking in this hotel, and to work further on this project that we're going to be discussing today. I'm going to share my screen and show you some pictures. I have my own title page, which perhaps can just be a backdrop for a couple of introductory remarks. That basically, first of all, as a preface, this is a work in progress. I have, as Professor Sassi said, I have a fellowship from the National Endowment of Humanities, a grant to write the book. The manuscript isn't due until the end of next year, and then the book won't appear probably for a year after that or something like that. So many of the ideas that I'll be discussing today, I've certainly done research, firsthand participant observation, on the ground research in China, thinking through the exact implications. Is something that I did in China, but I'm continuing to do now. So I'd appreciate any feedback that you have during the Q&A session. So this is really a work in progress. However, it's the work that I've been working on or interested in for the better part of the past decade, since returning to China in 2007, and then full-time really in 2009, through earlier this year when I was forced to leave. I was very interested in how Chinese people view their country's history. And I first wrote another book on religion and spiritual life in China, although that also had very much to do with how religious communities saw their history, because the history of these communities is something that the state also seek and control as part of its master narrative of how the Communist Party worked. And so for many of these religious groups, reclaiming their history was a vital part of their faith and their spiritual journey as well. But after finishing that project a few years ago, I began to just work full-time on this one. And it's something, of course, that I'll go into a little bit more later about why it's so important to Chinese people, or why I think it's so important to Chinese people. But it's not something that, of course, is entirely new. This is a completely historically accurate portrait of Sima Qian, the sort of grand historian, the first historian of China. I love these portraits because they often show a lot about what contemporary people think of the person. There's a whole genre of these paintings, usually showing the person to be very noble, good-looking, almost in a rakish, hipsterish way that would appeal to modern sensibilities. Sima Qian wrote one of the, certainly not the first history, but maybe the first really famous history of China. Was punished for it by being castrated and banished, and his children picked up the tale, and thus set sort of a template for the upright official for whom one of the key things was the correct or accurate in the best way that they could see writing of history. And here's another picture of him. I'm not sure if this is before or after his castration, but he's looking, writing the works out, and they're often very wistful. There's a whole, if you go online, you can find an enormous number of these things that are kind of quite funny. History is, as we know, it doesn't take that much great insight. History is quite sensitive in China. When I first went to China in the 1980s, I had this idea. People were talking then, especially about the Cultural Revolution, which had just ended 8 years earlier. And one of the first encounters I had with this pent up frustration was, I I was teaching, I was studying Chinese mainly, and then they recruited me to teach English at a trade school, which later became a university in Beijing. And I was having students write essays, as English teachers always do. And I was some innocuous thing, what's important in your life or something like that. And I got these, you know, my new bicycle or whatever it was. And then somebody just wrote this sort of 20-page outpouring about what had happened to them in the Cultural Revolution and their family. And I had no idea what to do with this, of course. I was petrified for the person who'd written it, but I could see that these events were still very fresh. And we tend to think of these events as being ancient history, you know, like, oh, the Cultural Revolution way back then in the pre-modern era of China, sort of contiguous here with Sima Qian or something like that. But especially then it wasn't, and even today it isn't, because it's these are events that shape the current leaders of China and events that shape the national consciousness. But I guess I had this initial idea that this was sort of in the past. Events like the Cultural Revolution were past, and the Great Leap Forward and the famine like that, they were past, and that these things didn't really have much relevance on today's China. And I guess in that sense, I had accepted the narrative of the Communist Party that after every big upheaval, there's kind of a reset. And the reset was 1978, Deng Xiaoping assuming control, new era, the reform era, and all of that is past and no longer relevant. As I said, it isn't really like that because these events aren't so far in the past. They're still within living memory of many, many people, including the leaders of the country. And these events, these historical events don't just stop. It's not like there's no history after 1978. There are enormously important events that happen in 1989, 99, and on up until today, this year even, with the pandemic, another enormously important event, which has created a whole new contestation of history in China. But early on, I spent time with this gentleman, Tan He-chung, who was a journalist in Hunan. And he had documented a massacre during the Cultural Revolution. And what interested me in his case, and in many of these cases, is that people didn't just work on them in the past, but they continue to work on these. This continues to motivate many, many people in China. China is sometimes described as a country undergoing mass amnesia, and this is not inaccurate in many ways. There's an excellent book on Tiananmen called The People's Republic of Amnesia, I think, by Louisa Lim. But still, even now, even when the price for pursuing these topics is very high, people continue to feel an inner need to research them. And this is, Tan has spent decades, Mr. Tan has spent decades compiling case studies about thousands of people who were murdered in his home province in Hunan, in one particular county, Dao County, Daoxian. And I spent several days with him retracing the steps of his research, looking at people, seeing what had become of the monuments. We visited tombstones of the dead people, including the one that you see in the picture here, which was erected by a widow for her husband and 3 people. The family in 1966 had been declared quote unquote black elements because they had essentially a high school education, and the wife, the widow, had worked as an elementary school teacher. Along with 27 other people, they were frog marched all night long to a small ridge with a limestone pit. The adults were clubbed in the head with a hoe and kicked into the pit. The children ran back from adult to adult crying, but they were pushed also into the pit because they were tainted with the blood of being the offspring of black elements. Eventually, they perished mainly from lack of food or water in this limestone pit, except for the one woman, Zhou Chen, who did survive. And that's a picture of her today. or at least a couple of years ago when we went and talked to her. This wasn't, and I think the interesting, these events, and whenever there are in China, and they're often seen as isolated events that don't have any bearing on the system. And so people will say, well, yeah, you know, there were these cases in Dow County, but, and this is actually an excuse used by people in officialdom, well, there are a lot of minorities in that area, and our minorities are barbaric, and you can't really control them when they get emotional, and there were regrettable incidents that took place. But Tan's research, and I think this is why for him it became so significant and why he pursued it for so long, is that he saw it as part of a systemic problem in China. And this was, of course, the party's unlimited power. And that the party, far from watching aghast as this tragedy unfolded, was actually actively pushing it. That these murders took place not only with the party because of the party's negligence, but because the party actively pushed the actors to do this. And there are, you know, people often think of the Cultural Revolution, perhaps one of the images we have is intellectuals who are forced to work in pigsties or do unpleasant work like that. But there's really no doubt among historians that roughly 1.5 million people were killed in the Cultural Revolution, some through neglect because they lacked medical care or something like that, or worked to death, but many people outright murdered, such as the people in Dow County. Later, I went with Tan to this bridge, which is over the Xiao River, where scores of people were sentenced by ad hoc people's tribunals, clubbed again with hoes or cut with scythes and tossed into the river. And the river was so bloated with the dead that it caused the hydro dam to clog up with corpses, and it was only unclogged about a year later. So I guess the key point that Mr. Tan made was that this was a deliberate policy. It wasn't due to fits of rage or anger or just resentment, settling of scores. That occurred also. The Cultural Revolution and other periods of chaos were an opportunity for people to settle scores in the village. But there was also on orders from Mao to eliminate Black elements. When he began his research in the 1980s, the party was in a phase of openness about the past and was willing to confront these problems. That was, of course, the champion back then was the general secretary of the party, Hu Yaobang, who only lasted a few years before being sidelined. They had many champions, such as this person, Li Rui, who was in the 1950s one of Mao's personal secretaries, and later had, I think primarily because he was persecuted for so long in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, had a change of heart and realized that there was a systemic problem with the party's leadership structure, with its power structure, with its pyramid type structure that doesn't allow a lot of questioning and makes it hard for correction of course. And Li Rui then, after he was released from labor in the late 70s, became a champion of many of these historians, especially as one of the advisors to this magazine called Yanhuang Chunzhou, or Annals of the Yellow Emperor. And so there was some high-level support for reevaluating the past and starting work on this, but it continued on throughout, after people like Hu Yaobang were sidelined, and it continues on today, even after journals like the Annals of the Yellow Emperor were closed down a few years. Li Rui passed away 2 years ago, I think, but this continues today. And so my question, I guess what I really was interested in is why this is so, why this continues. So over the past decade, I've been doing interviews with people you might consider or might call public intellectuals in China. The word is contested. What is a public intellectual, especially when there's so little public sphere in China? But these are people, and as I define them, and what is the focus of my research, these are people overwhelmingly are still inside China. So they're not dissidents working abroad. Nothing wrong with the work that those people have done. Excellent work, interesting, important work. But they're people who are still active in China. They often have one foot inside the system. So in China, you know, qi inside the system. So they're not necessarily, although some people in the picture you see here, you may know who some of them are sort of rebels and maybe more classic some way. And I think this is the key point. They try to shape the debate, even now in the past decade or so, when things have never been harder to do that. I'd say, I guess most people would agree that it's more difficult now to do things than at any point since the Cultural Revolution, excluding perhaps the 1 year 89, 90. But it is difficult now, but people are still doing this. Many of them are still publishing. Their venues for publishing are cut off. Their efforts to do this are compromised. It seems like the space for public debate and discussion is shrinking all the time. But people, such as these people in the you see here, they continue to try and push. So one of them is Mr. Tan. Some of the others here, the person in the upper left-hand corner, Jiang Xue, a journalist, the second from left in the top column, Guo Yuhua, a sociologist at Tsinghua University. Next to her, Chen Hongguo, who runs a public space in Xi'an called I Know Nothing, so on and so forth. And I won't go into all of them in depth, but I think to me they are emblematic of people in China who continue to work for change and to reevaluate the historical record. One of the groups that interested me the most, and that a touchstone for many of these people, is this group of young people in 1950s Gansu who started a journal called Spark, Xinhua. This is one of these ventures, and there must have been many, many other ventures like this in the 50s and 60s that we don't know about because they were simply erased. And perhaps we'll never know about them unless the Public Security Bureau's archives are somehow miraculously made public. I lived for many years in Germany where this did happen when the Stasi archives were raided by citizen groups and made public. I doubt strongly that will ever happen in China, but these kinds of stories are probably percolated up from the bottom, and I just think we just don't know a lot about them. But these were young people who had been at elite universities in China. They had been pegged as rightists in the 1957 anti-rightist campaign, which many of you may be familiar with, but if not, this was an effort by Mao and his loyal subordinates, such as Deng Xiaoping, to root out people who were seen as still following pre-liberation ideology, or who may have had sympathy, who may have been ex-KMT, Kuomintang, Nationalist Party members, or people who simply, mainly people who simply dared to speak out and say something. There had been an effort, I don't know how, probably not very honest effort, to foster some sort of criticism. The 100 Flowers movement, some of these people dared to then say, oh, I think the party could reform itself. This is often in the form of quite loyal criticism. They ventured to say something, and then they were attacked as rightists and then sent off to labor camps. And these four ended up in Gansu province in labor camp or in the town of Tianshui and some other areas around there. And they started this journal called Spark, which was, you see at the top, the character is Spark Xinhua, name on either side of it. And then below that, the next column says the year, 1960, and it's the first issue. Well, in fact, only one issue was actually ever published, such as it was, because one of the people there was able to get their hands on a mimeograph machine, and some copies of Spark were distributed. There's a second issue that was planned and sort of written out, but then the group was busted before they could actually even distribute this. What little we know of this group comes from the period in the 1980s when documents were made public through this reopening under Hu Yaobang, this effort to lift the anti-rightist label on many of these people. Some of the documents came out. Some people were able to go and look at their own police archives and copies of the magazine, which otherwise would not exist. I don't believe there's any extant copies outside the Public Security Bureau. If somebody knows of anything, tell me. There's only these reproductions, which are really not very good. And I don't know if there's actually a full reproduction of all the pages of all the issues. They've been hand copied out of the archives, but I don't think we actually have photos of each page of these magazines. But this magazine, again, it could have just died, right? I mean, something like this. One issue was circulated to maybe 50 or 60 people. Another ended up being seized by the police. What are the chances that something like this would ever matter to China? That it would just not just be one of these probably hundreds or thousands of other similar issues to criticize the party, to draw attention to the failings. And here the main failing was that there was a famine going on, a huge famine, of course, during the Great Leap Forward, when tens of millions of people died. And the party, these young students were trying to draw leaders' attention to this and say, well, there seems to be a problem here in Gansu province with famine. Don't know if anybody knows about this. Of course, there's famine across the country. Nobody really knew that. But this almost quixotic effort ended up resonating because the documents, the historical record did get out. It was then laboriously edited, put in order, copied, typeset in the 1980s and 1990s, and inspires people today in China, such as journalists who continue to go back. Even this year, there was a series of articles written on Spark. Last year or 2 years ago, one of the most important members of Spark, a woman named Tan Danxue, she passed away, but she wrote a book before that on the history of Spark, and she had been interviewed by many Chinese journalists. These articles have been posted on WeChat, on Weixin. Now, of course, the articles don't necessarily last that long before they are then taken down, but people then find workarounds. I'm not trying to draw some sort of romantic picture that people can bypass the censors. They can't, but these kind of events from the past aren't just of interest to the historical record that some people back in the 1950s and 60s were able to write and publish something like this, but that they still inspire people today. Of course, one of the most, I think, important documentary films to be made in the past decade, past 15 years, was called Spark by the independent director Hu Jie, who goes back and he really resuscitated the history of this. The film never was distributed in China, but it was many pirated copies of it. People send around DVDs of the film. This is a screen grab off that. And so, you know, people continue to be, and I think what's really interesting over the past few years is that people now realize when they heard about Spark, one of a very famous Chinese public intellectual who now actually resides in California, Cui Weiping, she said, now we have our lineage. Now we know that we aren't just thinking these thoughts for the first time. People have been thinking about this essentially since the beginning of the People's Republic and trying to grapple with the power structure inside China. There are generations of people who have been doing the same things. And I think that is an empowering and important idea for people today to know that they aren't they aren't reinventing the wheel, that people have been trying to do this. It can be also depressing to think that people have been crushed over the past decades for trying to do this. But I think it is important for people today and for this new generation of people who are doing it to know that there were people earlier. And so these are, you may say, okay, well, these are, public intellectuals and these are people who don't really resonate much in society. First of all, I would say that we don't know how historic change occurs. Historic change occurs through many different ways, and often it's by small numbers of people who keep a torch alive, who keeps ideas alive, and that later come back to resonate. And many of the people I talk to make that point. They say, we know today in China, we're never going to change the public debate in China. However, we hope to keep this alive, almost like a time capsule, so that people in the future will know that we've been working on these issues, and that when there is a more open period, and the history of the People's Republic has been one of constant change, so that what we see now is perhaps an unending period of crackdown, probably will not last forever, and that when things open up again in the future, works like this will still be important for people, and they'll know that this existed. There's efforts at public education. I mentioned this public space in Xi'an, which does not talk about such sensitive issues, but is an open space. It unfortunately just closed down a couple of weeks ago, which somewhat undercuts my effort to show that they continue today. But the public space, I Know Nothing, was run by this public intellectual, Chen Hongguo, shown there up on the podium, giving a very, very interesting lecture on King Lear, where he draws parallels between the befuddled old king who only listens to his daughters who tell him what he wants to hear, and the current leadership of China, which is surrounded primarily by yes men. And so through subtle efforts like this, you can see there are many people in China who, and what really struck me also were the number of people who came out. And so even if this particular venue and space in China closed down a couple of weeks ago, to me what's significant is this pent up interest, this feeling that these issues are still of vital importance for the nation and for the country, and that there are tens of thousands of people, I think without exaggeration, it's possible to say tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people around China who have similar ideas and who are yearning for some kind of a reckoning with the past. As I said, so you could say, well, these are middle class or people or public intellectuals, but yeah, these are some of the speakers there. These are people who I've had a lot to do with. They are stilt walkers. They walk on stilts, and they perform at temple fairs around the greater Beijing region. They are all working class people. They are part of a long sort of chain of these performances that goes back probably to the Ming, certainly the Qing dynasty, where they go and perform during a god or goddess's birth date. You can think of them as analogous, perhaps in the Western tradition, to carnival celebrations during the Easter season, when people get out and do all kinds of crazy things to celebrate this season. So these groups, there are about 80 or 90 of these pilgrimage associations around Beijing. This is, and their history is also contested. The party is seeking to revive groups like this because it sees them as part of quote unquote traditional Chinese culture and as a sort of healthy way for people to get out and support Chinese culture as an apolitical grouping of people. And indeed, these people are not out in any way. Let me just be clear. They do not have an overtly political agenda like some of the other people I showed. But they also are very interested in their history and are seeking to reclaim it from the government's overwhelming hegemony, if you want to use sort of jargon, um, or control of history. This group was founded in 1748, and they have a record of this going back to that period. And like here they are at the Temple Fair, and they also practice in the basement of this housing complex in Beijing. On the walls are, on the left-hand wall is a short, sort of that long block of calligraphy that you can see with many, many characters on the left wall. That is a short sort of history of the group. They also have banners of recognition from the government, and the government again wants to portray them simply as folk culture, as not having a significant religious or spiritual component, but they actually do have a very strong component because they, as I said, they perform for gods and goddesses. They have their own internal code of conduct, which is based on certain traditional principles. When they perform, they light incense to a deity, and they see themselves as part of a spiritual group. Of course, like many groups, they don't have just one identity. Many people who join these things join for various reasons, but part of it is spiritual reasons. So they have tried to find historic photos. These are photos from the 1960s, I think, I have to be sure. These are photos from when they were re-established in the 1980s. And then they, very interestingly, they found old members, and they did oral histories of all the people in their group. And this is not supported by the government at all. The government isn't necessarily opposed to it. I don't think the government really cares. But the significance is that these groups are trying to reclaim their history, and they show very clearly the motivation of the people. The motivations of these people is different from the government's. The government, again, wants to show the glories of Chinese culture, the glories of Chinese tradition, and maybe in some way legitimize the party's rule today as supporters of Chinese culture. These people are saying, sure, we're happy to perform, but we also have our own history, and it's a little bit different from the government's telling. They're not out there going, opposed to Communist Party, or I oppose the government's support of us. Not at all. The government, they think it's great that the government now wants to support traditional Chinese culture, but they are trying to keep a little bit of space that is not controlled by the government. You know, you might say, why does history matter to people, to these people, to many people in China, or to the party? And, you know, of course, history matters to all countries. And we see that especially in the United States today. The battle over American history in the wake of the Black Lives Matter toppling of statues, or not only toppling, but say the suggestion that many of these statues belong in a museum rather than on public pedestals. This is also a very long, drawn-out battle in our own country, in the United States, over history. And we know, of course, the passions that it inspires in the United States. And you know, this is also, these are not events, if you think the Cultural Revolution took place a long time ago, these events took place 100 years before the Cultural Revolution, and are still inspiring and bedeviling American society. So when people say, oh, well, that was a long time ago, it's like, well, Robert E. Lee and these guys were, they lived even longer ago, and still this history matters so much to Americans. So why not for Chinese people? And I think you could say that maybe especially in China, history matters, because history, as I mentioned earlier, it's been seen as one of the most important places where intellectuals prove their upright character by telling it like it is, and be willing to stand up to somebody like the emperor and pay very high prices. Overlaying this, I think, is the specificity of China being ruled by a communist party. In the communist system, it is based obviously on the ideas of Marx, who had a kind of historic determinism that was quite popular in the 19th century, that history is moving through stages. And so when when the authorities have been challenged in communist countries, it's often been on the basis of history. And here we see a picture of a protest in 1990 at the end of the Soviet Union by the historical society called Memorial. And Memorial challenged the party by, in a similar way, uncovering the tragedies of the Stalin era. And Memorial exists still today in Russia as a human rights organization. And so I think especially in a communist country, because, the way that the party justifies its hold on power is not that the party was elected by the people. And I think even historical research shows that it wasn't even really a mass movement, that the military operations that brought the Communist Party to power in 1949 were simply by mass military mobilization, such as the Soviet Union did in the war against Germany, and that this overwhelming military power, combined with the utter exhaustion of the Nationalist Party and its military force after having fought the Japanese and taking the bulk of the fighting from 1937 to 1945, that it exhausted the KMT. And of course, the KMT had many internal problems also. But that this is why essentially the Communist Party came to power. It wasn't really on the back of a popular uprising. Most people in China had not heard of the Communist Party when it took power in 1949. And they used history to justify that. History brought us to power. History had not been, the other people who had sort of tried to save China from foreign incursions in the 19th century, starting with the Opium War, up until 1949, there's this series maybe of well-meaning but misguided patriots, but that these people had failed. And only the Communist Party had succeeded, and that history had chosen the party to rule. And therefore, the party cannot be seen as having a deeply flawed history. Otherwise, a party that has made so many mistakes, why is it still fit to rule? Under what justification? So history in the past can be seen as bad, and the party has often made an effort to show that in the quote unquote old society, Zhou Shihui, everything was terrible and rotten. But then after 1949, despite some hiccups and some missteps, such as the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, by and large, it's been upward. So this is, I think, a typical communist narrative, that you can show that in the past things were bad, but because by definition the party, which is bringing us to a utopian situation, a utopia in the future, that it cannot be presiding over a period of one historical disaster after the other. And so, especially now, we see this effort to control the past. I would say this is, of course, sped up under Xi Jinping because the party realizes that challenging it is undermining its legitimacy. There were differing voices, even after 1989, after Tiananmen, that allowed for more openness in the 1990s, the 2000s, but I would say not starting directly in 2012 with Xi Jinping taking power, because that's a little simplistic, but roughly around that time, the party began to massively reassert control over the historical narrative. And yet people continue to work on this. As I mentioned, I was just talking the other day with somebody who is writing a book on the anti-rightist campaign at Peking University. And this woman is roughly my age, and therefore not old at all. But she she had a great interest in the anti-rightist campaign. And I said, well, why? You weren't even born when it took place. And she said, but my parents came from from Hunan, actually, coincidentally. And they were they'd worked at this newspaper, and they had half the people at this newspaper where her parents had worked had been declared rightists. And so if they hadn't, but fortunately they had managed to come to Beijing, they had changed work, and they had escaped this massive purge at the newspaper. But in the late 1970s, when the rehabilitation began, the people from Hunan would all come up to Beijing, often very sad, pathetic people who'd spent 20 years in labor camps. And they, of course, their parents, as their old colleagues who had worked back at the newspaper, they put them up in the apartment, let them sleep on the sofa or on the floor while they went to the party and sort of begged for some sort of recompense and to have their cases addressed. And so this was her education in it, that she heard about this firsthand from her parents' generation. And she went to Peking University and said, there's been no, to her knowledge, I'm not sure, I think she's right, there's been no book written just on the anti-rightist campaign at Peking University. And I asked her why Peking University, and she said, well, not only is it my alma mater and I feel a special responsibility, but there's a lot of material on Peking University. And I think it's probably no coincidence that there's very little material on another university in Beijing that had a huge purge in the anti-rightist campaign, which is Tsinghua University. And that's because the past two party general secretaries, Hu Jintao and the current one, Xi Jinping, both went to Tsinghua. A friend of mine who used to spend a lot of his time going through these kind of antique markets where they often will sell material from what was essentially scrap paper, which was then found to have a lot of interesting material on it. And this was then sold to amateur historians at these antique markets. All the material on Tsinghua evaporated when Hu Jintao took power in 2002, right? I think this is only continued under Xi Jinping. But Peking University, there's still some material. And I said, well, certainly there can't be any material that's available now, right? The party has got control of everything, but she's still able to go onto online bookstores and find material that people are selling. The material sells out quickly. She has to go online many, many times a day and just keep inputting certain keyword searches, and the material does come up. Firsthand accounts, school newspapers, things like that that are published. She does go to used bookstores and finds material like that. Sometimes the books don't have an obvious title. It's not like the title of the book or the material is the anti-rightist campaign at Peking University. It will be about somebody's memoirs. It'll have some sort of another title. But once you begin to really work into the material, you realize what to look for, who the authors are, what the books and collections of materials are, and you know the keywords to input, and you can find stuff and just buy it. Don't ask for what the condition is, what the material is, just ask for it. Now, of course, this isn't ideal historical research because we don't know really where it came from. Who wrote it? Sometimes it's not even clear, but it does sometimes give insights. And of course, there's still overseas publications, people who wrote about some of these things overseas in Hong Kong and so on. Up until recently, Hong Kong was a great source of material like that. And so she is, and also oral history. People still do oral history. Again, there are still people alive from this era. It's amazing to me how much oral history is still going on in China and what a popular topic that is. And in fact, here's a picture of an oral history workshop that I participated in a few years ago, where you see the number of people here. There were roughly 50 participants in the workshop. And these are not, again, these are not people who are out to overthrow the Communist Party or something like that, but they are intensely interested in finding out what really happened in my family, because people don't really have even a clue what even happened in China in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And that grandparents will sometimes, drop something about, oh, the Sanyan Kunnan, the 3 years of difficulty. What do you mean by that? What 3 years of difficulty? Well, the 3 years of natural disaster. Oh, well, I heard about that. There were natural disasters in the late 1950s and that caused a famine. And then maybe the grandparent will go, well, there's more to the story than that. And then they'll say, well, what do you mean? And then this inspires people to say, okay, well, I want to sit down. I want to know how to do an oral history. What do I actually do? What are how to ask questions? I mean, many of you in the audience probably ask questions and do research for a living, but for a lot of people, it's not so obvious. And especially with digital technologies, let me get a camera, not that expensive now to get a really good camera. It's amazing now, really, how good the equipment is compared to what, was specialist equipment 20 or 30 years ago is now cheap equipment now. So just get a digital camera and a tripod and a clip-on microphone, and then have grandma and grandpa sit down, maybe go back to your hometown that your family left a generation ago and go talk to the old people in the village. And there was a project that was done recently, it doesn't exist anymore, where this artist in Beijing ran sort of an artist collective workshop where he had young people go back out to their villages. But it's not just things like that. It's many people are interested in this today. They still go out and do these kinds of things. They write up their family histories. And this reminds me in some ways of projects that resonate perhaps in the United States. I mean, even just the personal history. If you think of one of the very important works in the 1970s that Black Americans, by Black Americans, Alex Haley's Roots, which is just recounting his family's story, and that trying to recover his family story going back to slave era, that this was so important for Black Americans. In a similar way, although it's not possible to publish these works the way Alex Haley could publish his work and grab a nation, but just the empowering way that this, and the way that it changes people's thoughts. Aha, so that's the way it was in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. There was more to the story. It doesn't make people into dissidents, but it makes them more critical and more thoughtful about their country's history. Okay, I want to wrap this up because I've been talking now for about 45 minutes. I want to go back to Mr. Tan, our historian, our amateur historian. Mr. Tan had been sent to Dow County in the 1980s during that period of openness. And the party realized that there had been these massacres. They sent him down to write a history of it. And he went, and so the party's version of writing a history would be to say, these regrettable incidents took place, they were isolated, what a pity, we've now made compensation to the people, and it's now over. Written a little history, everything's clean, cleared up, and we can just file that in the historical archive. Small hiccup that happened on the way to Bright Utopia. But Mr. Tan realized that as he continued his work in the 80s and 90s, the people who had carried out the massacre were never punished. They were still in charge of the party in the 80s, and they were in charge of the local government. Their offspring were in charge of the local government even today, many of them, and that the past had not been rectified. He then submitted his article. It was never published. He remained an editor at a state-run literary magazine, but was kept on the margins. He was never promoted or allowed to attend conferences or help judge writing competitions. But he kept at his own dime. He traveled down from Changsha to Dow County once a year, twice a year. This is back before high-speed rail. Now it's easier to go down to Dow County, but it wasn't so easy. And he kept going on and on because he wanted to write a definitive history. Eventually, he published his book in 2011 in Hong Kong, and there's now an English version of it. And he's a very colorful guy, Mr. Tan. And I sort of said, well, why do you, and he even now he's still working at it and revising the book and revising the book and revising the book and working on other histories as well. And I asked him why he continued at it. And he gave me this funny, colorful quote. He said, you know, I can kiss ass as well as anyone. I'm really good at it. In fact, I'm an excellent ass kisser. I can tell people what they want to hear, and I can write an article in the way that you want it. But I have a minimum moral standard. I can't turn black into white. Somehow I just can't do that. So when they said they wouldn't publish it, I thought, okay, that's your problem. But my life had changed. And so I thought, this is it. One way or another, I will publish this. And he did. And so with that, I want to stop and turn back to you all and maybe questions that you might have.
All right. Thank you so much, Ian. We've had a few questions come in, and if you're ready, I'd just like to bounce a few of them at you.
Of course, great.
So here's one. How has the pandemic impacted contemporary dissidents' visibility within China?
Well, I think that the pandemic, it hasn't had an immediate impact. I think we had a general tightening on dissent that's been going on over the past few years, maybe the past decade. The sort of meta narrative maybe is that, after the internet was invented by Al Gore in the 1990s, I'm just joking, but there's this story, this sort of triumphalist American narrative that the internet was going to change everything, that nobody could control the internet. And for a few years in China, it seemed like it was really hard to contain. And in the 2000s, up until around, say, 2010 or something like that, there were a huge number of blogs and a vast outpouring of very critical work, exposés. The party ratcheted control without killing the internet. I think this is the party's genius. The party realizes we need digital technologies, we need the internet, we need it for the economy, we need it also to push our message to people, but we will find ways to isolate and marginalize people. And I think that it has continued to do that. Now, for a while earlier this year, there was an outpouring of anger and frustration, especially in Wuhan, over how the party did not control the virus. This is reflected in the blog kept by Fang, the Wuhan writer, which has been recently translated and published in English. And I think it's well worth looking at that because it sort of shows this arc. Fang was lionized, just keep a blog, it's great. People stayed up at night to read it. She would sometimes finish writing it at 3 o'clock in the morning, and people would read it and then circulate it and so on. And then afterwards, after she was sort of vilified by many people, you can say, well, these are just party propagandists who vilified her. But I think a lot of people sort of said, well, the party didn't do a bad job controlling the virus compared to the debacle in countries like the United States, which is actually true. It's not just party propaganda, right? It's definitely true. And so I think that probably the visibility for dissidents increased. However, I do think that the pandemic and the tragedy of what happened in Wuhan, which to some degree was preventable, I think, that this has created yet another scar on the mental map of China. This is this thing that history doesn't just end with the 1978 and the reform era, that these things keep coming over and over again. I was struck, there's a film that was just made by Ai Weiwei called Coronation. It's like sort of a play on words. And, the film has its pluses and minuses, but it shows a very touching sequence about a man who's trying to go get his dad's urn. His father died because of COVID-19, and he's not allowed to go get the urn unless people from his father's work unit accompany him. And this is because they want to make sure that loyal party members are next to him, just to show our support, of course. But I think as the party is afraid of any outpouring of grief and this inability to grieve really what happened in Wuhan, this terrible thing, thousands of people dying, this turn very quickly from "we got it all under control," triumphalist narrative. It's left scars in places like Wuhan, and there are still citizen journalists and people who are working on alternative histories to what happened, trying to figure out what happened in those crucial weeks earlier in the very beginning of the year, when the party seemed to sort of try to sweep this under the carpet. So yeah, I don't think it's been a huge benefit for dissidents, but I think there are people still working on these topics.
Hmm. All right. Another question is about the question of precisely controlling the narrative, though about much more than the pandemic. The question asks, Xi Jinping seems to have been able to control the narrative of the Communist Party and of Chinese history within the country. How did he pull it off? How did he manage to persuade many people, possibly most people, that the party's narrative is the correct one?
Well, I think the party obviously has an overwhelming control over the education system and media. And so part of it is simply, if you can control the curriculum, and you can control the output of information to people, then you can control how a lot of people think. It doesn't mean there won't be people critically. I think there are obviously people who experience things in their daily life. That's why it's often quite interesting. But usually a lot of people's knowledge is dependent on their personal experience. Like, my father died of COVID-19, let's say, right? And then I think about things like that, but maybe I wouldn't otherwise think about things like that. Or I was a student in 1989, or my parents were caught up in the Great Leap Forward, and therefore I heard about these stories. So it often becomes quite personal. And then there are people in China, as we know from people who study VPN uses. These are virtual private networks that can spring over the Great Wall of China, the Great Firewall of China, and get out of the party's control. That there are hundreds of thousands of Chinese who have VPNs and who use them on a daily basis. And I don't think they're all reading, the collected works of the Dalai Lama or watching Ai Weiwei's documentary. Thank goodness, probably. But they're probably just looking at various things that interest them, or trying to use Gmail or Facebook or Twitter because they studied abroad and are coming back or something like that. But there are certainly people who are able to get access to other forms of information. So there is a group of people that I think shouldn't be underestimated, who do have other sources of information. But overall, and I think the other side of it is, it isn't just government control. I mean, after all, if China had bread lines, if China had a disastrous economic situation, then it would be hard for the party to keep up this myth that it's bringing prosperity. But because since the 1970s and 80s, many hundreds of millions of people have become much more prosperous in China. It's easier for the government to push its story. At the end of the day, what motivates people in China is what motivates most people around the world, which is that they have a stable, happy family life, that they have an interesting job, that their children have a brighter future than they had. Those are the things that interest people in the world. It's not historical narratives and things like that. So if you can bring people prosperity, then you can get rid of sort of 90% of the potential critical voices. I mean, the thing is, I think in the Soviet Union and the East Bloc countries, they failed to do that. And so you had so many people began to follow people like Sakharov and other dissidents who probably wouldn't have cared about these people if they'd had enough bread and vodka and could buy a car. And I remember going to East Germany in 1988, and there was a 7-year wait to buy a car. I mean, 17 years, it was sort of absurd. It was ridiculous. And so you could see people were just rolling their eyes like, what kind of a messed up system are we in? And that drives people to dissent. But in China, you don't have that.
Another question. One of our viewers wants to hear a little more about the stilt walkers and what prompts them to spend time preserving a space for their own post-49 histories. Is this largely a question of having a narrative that they themselves control? Or is there an aspect of the official narrative that they're dissatisfied with, even if, on the whole, they're glad to have some state patronage? Is it your impression that religious groups that you know so well have similar inclinations to preserve control of their own histories?
What motivates people is that I think there are different things. It's not inside these groups. There are people who feel that working with the government makes it debases the group. That by taking government money, you now have to, and this is true, you now have to perform on government holidays. So you have to perform around the October 1st holiday. You have to perform maybe even around July 1st is the PLA's founding, the People's Liberation Army, the founding of the PLA, or more likely on the May Day holiday. And, a lot of people are quite, hey, whatever, May Day, big holiday, I'm great. I can go participate in a big event, and maybe we even get a little bit of money for that, a little bit of pocket money. It's never a lot of money. It's never about the money. People make the mistake the government supporters about the money, but the government does not support them with a lot of money. But and they don't really care. But other people say, no, wait a minute. If we're going to be true to our lineage, to our ancestors in this group, and often it is ancestors because they're often family lineages, this is about performing at this temple. And you can't do that if are you able to light incense to the deity at the May Day holiday? No, you're not. You just go up there, and then sometimes they get a different banner. They're called the such and such neighborhood folk culture group. And you don't even have the proper name of the group, and you can't light the incense to the deity, you can't perform properly. Now, this is probably a minority of people, but there are people who refuse to participate in these government programs, or who at least think that let's get the true, accurate story about the way things were in the past, just to respect the past. But it's not necessarily because they're out to criticize the government.
No. I was very impressed, by the way. This is me talking, not reading a question, but just a parenthetical remark. The role of old people, right? Because the old people are both the people who have the memory of events to pass on, and in some way they have nothing at stake. They have nothing to lose. Almost nothing, less to lose, let's say, by telling their stories, right? So we have this me that often elderly are the avant-garde in these discussions about memory and restoring the image of the past.
Yeah, I think that is true. You do see a lot of young people who are interested in the past, but the older generation, I mean, one of the things in China, as I was saying, is that it often depends on your experience. So the old people, just by virtue of having been around the block a few times, they understand more accurately how things work. And I remember this is when I was working as a correspondent in China at a newspaper. We would often hire researchers, and people would say, what you really want to do, this is people who didn't know anything about China. They say, what you really want to do is you want to hire somebody who just graduated from Peking University, from Beida. You want to hire a new graduate. They're smart, they're young, they get the internet. They're going to be, and they've passed all, and they're the smartest, the creme de la creme. And those are the people you really want to hire. I'm like, with all due respect to all recent Beida graduates watching this, but those people often know nothing about how China works because their head has been stuck in Gaokao tests to get into Beida. They've been memorizing and regurgitating stuff, often on campus. They haven't had any real life experience. And I think that people who, if you want to know how to get things done in China, just on a practical basis, it's better to find somebody who's more in their 30s or even 40s because they had some real life experience. And so often young people might sort of say, well, this is all old history. Well, that was back then. Oh, wow, amazing and great leap forward. But then when they live, as they live through the pandemic, perhaps, and when they get to be older, then they'll be the people who will say, well, let me tell you what happened in Wuhan in the pandemic, and that so-and-so died and they were never given a proper burial, or they died of COVID, but it was not counted as COVID, or blah, 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 blah. No, they may also say what a great job the party did in the case of the pandemic. But there are many things like that, whether it's Tiananmen in 1989, the Falun Gong crackdown that sent tens of thousands of people to labor camps, and all the family members who know about that. These are events that really affected people. And so I think then it's generally people who then have some firsthand experience, and by definition, those are people tend to be older. But yeah, you're also right that people who are older, they've got their jobs, they've got their pension, they're probably not going to lose it, and so they are able to speak out a bit more freely.
Here's a question about your work as a journalist with informants, with people who are telling you their stories. Someone says, how do you manage the challenges and responsibilities inherent to bringing attention to different voices in China and preserving them? People clearly want their stories told, says the questioner, but you would have your own judgments to make in telling these stories. How does that situation present itself to you?
It's a great question. I'm just writing a response to a book that just came out by an ethnographer, Harriet Evans, who wrote a book called Beijing from Below, where she talks to people who live in this famous old street near Tiananmen called Dashalar. And she spent years and years and years going back and back and back to Dashalar to talk to the people there about how their lives had changed. And she adopts the traditional ethnographer's use of pseudonyms to protect people, even though, and she struggled with this, even though these people wanted their stories told. And I think it's kind of interesting in some way, because the conventions of the, especially American-driven, sociological, almost condescending way that, people can't look out for themselves, and we have to look out for them for them. I know it's well meant, and it's often was driven by medical research and stuff like that, which didn't look out for the interests of patients and subjects of research. But I think sometimes, you don't want to look down on people, but you do need to explain to people, especially people who are not, say, these public intellectuals that I've mentioned. You want to explain to them what the potential risks are. And I've had many occasions when I've interviewed people, say some farmer over land use, and I say, okay, so the convention in American newspapers is the opposite of the American academic convention, which is you have to use real names, because otherwise you can just make it up, right? So I mean, who knows? Harriet Evans could have gone to Dasha Lawrence, made all this stuff up. Oh, some people, because you don't know, they're not real people. They're never going to call you on it. You don't know who they are. But you have to then say to them, is it okay to use your name? And sometimes they'll say, Mei Wenqi, no problem. They'll pull out their ID card, they'll pull it up and say, take a picture of that and show that to Xi Jinping. And you're like, okay, maybe I won't do that, because that's crazy. And then you're like, well, let's think this through. And then you just talk to them about the potential repercussions. And then often in those cases, I'll opt for to anonymize them, and just, I think most editors of newspapers and media, mass media now, are much more willing to do that. I had a friend who worked at USA Today. They had a Beijing bureau for quite a while, and USA Today has this ironclad rule: you cannot have any unnamed sources, period. So there's just many things they don't report on, even in the United States. Somebody leaking Trump's tax documents or something like that, we need to know who it is. We need to know where it's coming from. Readers have to be able to decide the veracity of this, and they need to know where it's coming from. So they had this ironclad rule, and so this drove this guy crazy in Beijing, because he's like, I can't use all these people's names, even. So you have to weigh that. I think the prime directive for people reporting on other cultures, no matter where you are, is do no harm. Right? You don't want to, the worst thing that would happen to me is I would be expelled from China, right? And so that's not going to, okay, maybe nowadays things are changing in China. Maybe foreign correspondents will end up in jail. But so far, that's not the case in China. In China, the reality is the worst thing that happens to foreign correspondents is they get expelled. But for the people on the ground, it could have dire consequences. And and even not necessarily getting them in trouble with the government, but even maybe they didn't quite realize that their life story might be embarrassing in some ways they didn't think of. I did an article for the Wall Street Journal on some ordinary person around the time of the Olympics and how their rise to prosperity and why they supported the party and all that. It was actually really, really positive. No problem with the government, but I mentioned that he had remarried, and it didn't occur to me this might be a problem. It actually was a problem. And he said, "How could you write that?" And then I was like, "You didn't say don't write that you're remarried. You told me," and the whole thing. I didn't even make a big deal of it. I just sort of mentioned it in passing. And then this is added. The sort of new thing, not new, but new in the past decade, is that foreign correspondents used to be writing almost into a vacuum. You write this thing, it would appear back in Baltimore or Philadelphia or Chicago or someplace like that. It would never appear. But now, especially the big media organizations like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, they have Chinese websites. And so they translate everything into Chinese. And even if these sites are blocked, people still do screenshots and so on and so forth and circulate the articles. And so you have to be especially careful. I think it's great overall because, but you have to be careful and help people think through these issues.
Yeah. Another question about the oral history workshop. Who organized it and generally who attended? I have long thought, says the questioner, that these sorts of workshops could play such an important role in China right now.
Yeah, that's a great question. It was actually organized by a university. It was organized by the in Chunmei Dashi, on the east side of the town. I'm blanking on the name of the university. I went there for the workshop. But it was then, they have actually an oral history, even a little museum that was founded by this very well-known journalist, Cui Yong. Anyways, and Cui, this center was has a history of oral history in China. In some ways, the party likes oral histories because they think you're just going to be talking about how terrible things were before 1949. Because they sort of, when they took power, they kind of used these impromptu oral histories of people in struggle sessions about the terrible landlord and how bad it was in the old days. And so they like those kind of oral histories, or how heroic the Red Army was in fighting the Japanese or the KMT. And so those kind of oral histories are popular and often lionized. And so they held this oral history workshop there, but wasn't, but the people running it, were all, again, this is what's interesting to me. These are not dissidents. These are people who are inside the system, and sent out people to go back to their communities. And these were people from all around China. You say, who are the people? They were, I don't think they represented all walks of life in China. They represented people who wanted to run their own blogs, who all had a college education, maybe were interested in journalism. Or many of them told me, I just want to do my family history. So they went up to Beijing for this long weekend, and it cost a few thousand yuan, so maybe cost $500 to $1,000 if you had everything together. But for them, it was quite worthwhile.
Yeah, I guess you would say that they're not official, right? They're unofficial without necessarily being oppositional. But they're simply not, not under the purview of any state interest. Here we go. We've got a kind and anonymous person, 谢谢你, who says, is that 中国传媒大学?
Yes.
Would that be Cui Yongyuan?
Yes, Cui Yongyuan. Yes,
right.
Thank you. Yeah. I knew it was Cui and it was Yong, but I couldn't think what it was.
Yeah.
This is 口述历史研究所 or something like that.
Yeah.
Research
okay.
Center.
Oh. Yeah. We did finally establish some knowledge today. This is good. You're doing oral history, Ian. This is great. All right, another question. People such as Li Rui and Deng Liqun have both official publications as well as things that are not permitted to be in print in China. Are their banned writings also a part of the unofficial history that you wrestle with?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the people who do this do not have access to publishing, especially in recent years where it's been harder enough to do that kind of thing. So it used to be in the past that you could publish books. You had to buy essentially you had to buy an ISBN number. You had to get an ISBN number, a Shu Hao, and so the Shu Hao would be given by parties, but there were sometimes it would be given by the publisher, and publishers had a quota on the number of numbers they had to give out. But sometimes there were publishers that, by hook or by crook, you could get different kinds of you get these things, but that's harder and harder to do. Sometimes you can get a book number, a Shu Hao, if by making it a foreign publication. And these foreign publications, and essentially are not allowed, for some reason, you can get, these foreign publications can be sold, but not through any official channel. So they can be published. So you cannot sell them in a bookstore, you can't sell them online, but you can still publish them. So the publisher can then can still print the book and not get in trouble. But the book can only essentially be sold out of your suitcase or through friends or something like that. So it's a weird loophole, but there are several people who are publishing these unofficial histories say that that's what they plan to do. It's probably a better way. I mean, you can also, in the past, you could go to Hong Kong and get things published. But I think that's increasingly less likely given the national security law being extended down into Hong Kong. And then also if it's, they would have to smuggle them always back up to Beijing, and it got harder and harder to do that. Customs got savvy to that. So, but no, the unofficial histories are definitely, or illegally or underground publications are still very much part of it, I think, yeah.
Another question about the broad tent of the Chinese dissident world. How to address discourse of anti-CCP and anti-China, anti-leftist and pro-Trump Chinese dissidents in the diaspora and in China.
Yeah, it's a very interesting phenomenon. Just the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I guess that's what they tend to think. So it's sort of Trump has positioned himself as this big China hawk, and so if you want the party to change, or you don't like the party, then you think Trump is your friend. I think personally, I think it's damaging to many of these sort of liberal intellectuals, or who would consider themselves to be liberal intellectuals, because they are siding with somebody who maybe doesn't share their liberal values, and that if you ally yourself with somebody for just for your own narrow tactical issue, I understand why you might do that, but in the long run, I'm not sure that helps you, because those people are not really interested in your cause. They're not. There are certainly people. I know a couple of people who worked in the Trump administration who formally given the journal Matt Potter, he's on China policy. I know he really cares about China. He's interested in China. He thinks he's doing the right thing. But I think a lot of the people around Trump who push this are not genuinely concerned about China. And so I think by aligning yourself with people like that, you're compromising yourself in the long run. But I understand.
And finally, let's see, we've got two more quick questions. One, do you think that documenting history as it was is a way for intellectuals to fight desperation under conditions of crackdown?
Well, I think it's, I'm not exactly sure by desperation, but I think first of all, it's a common human yearning to know what happened in the past and where we came from and what happened in our societies in the past. I think this is a common thing shared by many people. It's probably more doable to research history. Now that you mentioned this, it makes me think it's probably more doable to research history than to struggle right now to change something in China, say a specific policy issue. For example, many people around 10 years ago, they were able to agitate, or not agitate, but lobby for change of specific policies in China, such as arbitrary arrest, the Sunzhigang case around, what was that, 2003, that catalyzed many people, then published articles about it and got change to police reform. That's not possible, I don't think, anymore. But that kind of a case, which is sometimes mentioned, happened in the pre-era. And so in that sense, it's easy and look at history for.
Here's our absolute last question. How about willful amnesia? People are blind to the past happier than those who carry it with them.
Right. I mean, you know, I've tried to forget my past, and it's made me a really happy person. No, I mean, you know, so I do think there's something. There is this story that is very popular in the West that people tell them things. Some were all endless in order to be. And I think there's a certain amount of faddish thinking in that. Faddish is in the past 100 years, faddish. So thinking, but I think that, you know, and there's something to be said for, you want to recognize the past, but you don't want to become obsessed by past grievances. You know, there are people who I've met in China who will follow their pursuit to justice until they are smashing their head against a wall time and time again. There used to be these petitioners who would go to Beijing, to Shangfang, and they would petition and petition and petition. And, you know, these were often people who, I'm sure they suffered injustice. I mean, just you look at the reams of papers they would have, it was incredible the amount of stuff that they had. And you're like, you know, you probably did suffer injustice, but you've spent the past 20 years trying to get this, and the amount of money, and it's principle. You know, I get it, it's principle, but meanwhile, you're dragging your kid up to Beijing, your kid needs to go to school, maybe without letting it go and forgetting it, but maybe it would be better to some degree to let it go and not obsess about this injustice and just get on with your life. And I think every country needs to have that also. But and so it's not like I think China should be obsessed with the past or should always be harping on the Cultural Revolution. That's not what I would advocate, or what I think most of these people advocate. I think, though, it is fair enough to say that these issues haven't been dealt with, and that there's people who it still bothers, and that on some level there has to be, you know, a reckoning with the past, because otherwise it's very hard to understand where people come from. I think people are you know, it's very similar to me. Like when we moved from Canada to the United States in the late 1970s, and we would have this history class. You know, it always sort of ended in 1945. And then, you know, sort of as a smart aleck kid, I would go, hey, what about the Vietnam War? Why don't we how to something like that, right? But, you know, I don't know, maybe in high schools now they teach about the Vietnam War and the civil rights struggle, and they probably do a better job. But there was this convenient thing in American history where it sort of ended with this glorious triumph, America, you know, liberating the world from fascism and so on and so forth. But I do think that if you want to understand, you want to be able to read newspapers and so on and understand where you are, you have to understand the past. And so I think this common universal yearning is something that will just continue in China.
Yeah. You know, there's a word that we haven't pronounced this whole evening, and that interests me. It's trauma, right? That would otherwise be one of the first words I think that people would utter when they're thinking about historical trauma. And, you know, people respond to trauma in lots of different ways. One of my teachers was a kid who was flown out of Germany in 1938 or 9. He lost track of his mother. After the war, she somehow survived and they were reunited. And he said, you know, what was it like? And she said, I don't want to talk about it. And she never did. And that was how she dealt with it. Now, not everybody can successfully do that, but, you know, in some ways I have to take my hat off to her willpower, just to say, it happened, I don't want to live with it anymore.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, I think a lot of people, I've heard that also, and people say, well, what's the use of talking about it? And I say, you never told your kids about that? Well, what's the point? I'm just going to make them unhappy. They can't change it. Right. This is the system we're in. Let's try to you know, they still have to live in the system. Why make them unhappy and disgruntled? And maybe they'll wreck their careers trying to, you know, get justice for what happened to me or something like that. Just let's move on. And I can totally understand that. I think it's completely understandable.
Yeah. But then, you know, maybe by getting history out into the world of where it can be publicly known and discussed, you're preventing the next disaster, right? This is what historians have always told us about their trade. It might be a self-interested claim, but it seems to make sense to me. But, you know, on the intimate scale, it's a different kind of thing, right?
Yes, I think on an intimate scale, it is, and yet, yeah, I do find people will say over and over again, we have to know what happened in the past, and I do think history in China, it is one of the, being a historian is sort of almost like you're part of a sacred tribe of people. It has still a high status, you know. So all the historians in the audience can pat themselves on the back. But it's also fraught with problems, things like that. So.
Yeah. Well, Ian, we have exploited you mercilessly. I'm not even looking at the time, but we've kept you for a good long while. Thank you for a really splendid talk and a tour around otherwise hard to access parts of contemporary China. I want to address the audience and tell them thank you again for joining us tonight. We look forward to hosting you at the next event sponsored by the Center. So good night to all. And Ian, I know we will be carrying with us the reflections that you have spurred in us. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for this opportunity. Appreciate any feedback.
Sure enough.